morning. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to today's panel session on innovation partnerships, how to leverage the wider ecosystem to build new innovation opportunities. My name is Wei Sun. I'm from SC Ventures and I'm on the client engagement team at SC Ventures. In this session, I have with me three esteemed panelists from three different industries today to share with us a cross-industry view of how we can leverage partnerships to bring new innovations to organizations. We hope to find out more about how we can work better with startups, governments, as well as other corporates to explore new opportunities in this increasingly complex world and situations that we now frequently find ourselves in. Just some quick housekeeping before I introduce my panelists. Since we have a full day of panels today, we don't really have that much time for the session. So we have about 30 minutes of panel discussions, followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A for you guys to dive a little bit deeper into any of the points that have been brought up by the panelists. And so without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. Starting from your left, my right, we have Luke Wu, Managing Director of The Gear by Kajima. Kajima Corporation is one of the largest construction companies in Japan, as well as globally, and has a big hand in building many iconic buildings around the world, including in Singapore. Next up, we have Sidne Yeo, Asia Head, Lufthansa Innovation Hub. It's part of the global aviation group headquartered in Germany, owning Lufthansa Airlines, Swiss Air, Austrian Air, amongst other air carriers. Following that, we have Santosh Patel, who leads our SC Ventures Fintech engagement workstream, which includes our open innovation platform, Fintech Bridge. Fintech Bridge helps us to connect fintech with the needs of our many business partners within the bank as well as across the broader ecosystem. Just to set a little bit of context and background for the discussion today, I would first like to invite each of the panelists to maybe share a little bit more about the innovation work that they undertake in their jobs, as well as how their organizations have been approaching innovation through partnerships. With that, maybe I can invite you to kick off.
Good morning. So for myself, right, so at the Gear, we are a subsidiary of Kajima Corporation. We're based here, we was recently set up, and it has three main functions, right? The first function is that we operate our regional headquarters and first overseas R&D facility in Changi as a smart building. So that's the first function. Second function is that it's an open innovation platform for the APAC group. So essentially, we just try to promote tech adoption, startup engagement, work with students, etc. Blah blah blah. That's the second function. The third is that we are also the IP commercialization arm of the group. So for a bit of context, right, in 1949, Kajima set up a research institute, right? We called it the Kajima Techno Research Institute, and it was tasked to build Japan's first skyscraper, right? Those of you who are familiar with Tokyo, if you've been to the Akasaka area, there's the Kasumi Gaseki building. It's actually a station on the Hibiya line. We built that in 1968, about 20 years later. And all that came from a lot of the R&D that we did over that time. So now what we're trying to do is, can we take all this old rope, right? All this R&D we've developed, mostly for internal capability development, can we then spin that off as products or even startups in the future? So this is, it's a very new function. It's the first time for the group, right? And the Gear is responsible for that IP translation as well.
Cool. Hey everyone, Sidne here. So I'm representing Lufthansa Innovation Hub. We're essentially the venture arm of the Lufthansa Group. So if anyone's familiar with the European airline, we conduct a few activities on behalf of the group. So we drive tech research because we want to be a thought leader in the travel tech space. So while Lufthansa focuses on aviation, we focus on everything travel tech. We also have a huge new business team that invests in startups on behalf of Lufthansa. We build ventures, so we're a venture studio. And we drive partnerships, which is something that we'll run today. And one more department that talks about digital transformation, because we realize that the aviation industry is aging, right? And so it's also kind of a marketing effort to ensure that we're presenting ourselves as a younger brand to open up the funnel for new talent.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning again. Yeah, I'm Santosh. I take care of the Fintech engagement work stream, which is what we try to do is to bring innovation into the bank. So again, as many of you may be aware, we are a venture arm or an innovation arm of the parent bank, Standard Chartered Bank. 160-year-old bank. I'm sure it has a lot of, you must be aware of a lot of legacy and everything else that goes on in any bank. So what we try to do is to try innovation, look external, and bring that inside, and see how we can solve or leverage the emerging technologies, new fintechs coming in, and that's a gateway that we provide as part of fintech engagement.
Thank you very much, all three panelists, for the introduction to your organization. I think since we've got kind of representatives from various different industries today, I think it's quite an interesting mix of industries. What we want to dive a little bit deeper on today is kind of how you and your organization actually looks to innovate through working with partners in other industries perhaps, right? As we know, many ecosystems or innovation ecosystems tend to be a little bit more focused internally, right? Within your own industry ecosystem. So I'd just like to kind of start off and tap a little bit about your experience, if you have, right, in terms of how you have been looking at partnerships outside of your own traditional ecosystem. For example, finance looking beyond fintech, construction looking beyond big tech, and even airlines looking beyond travel tech, right? Maybe you could start off, Sidne, you could share a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned, Lufthansa focuses on aviation, and we look at everything around the traveler journey. So we have a research team that considers topics that the board of Lufthansa would never consider. As an example, NFTs, right? So we had a research piece talking about how NFTs would impact travel, and we then went on to build a venture in collaboration with Polygon that essentially allows customers to collect NFTs when they scan their boarding passes. And you complete a collection, and then you receive rewards like lounge passes, seat upgrades, etc. So if not for considering topics outside of our own ecosystem, this kind of venture would never come to life. And so that's the importance of the research that we do, and an example of how we incubate new projects within the Lufthansa group.
Yeah, Luke?
Actually, for us, it really depends on how you define the sector, right? If you talk about contact, specifically at construction technology, then actually we don't really work with a lot of people within our direct ecosystem. As you know, building, our profits are at the margins, right? It's really, we've squeezed out. And skilled labor anywhere in the world. The difference that you have is maybe a bit of know-how, you save a bit of time. So generally speaking, and also being a Japanese company, we are not very open to working with competitors, right, as you can imagine. It's very close, it's very inward-looking. So actually, traditionally, right, by design, a lot of the innovation partnerships, especially when it came to the R&D arm, right, set up 75 years ago, right, has been with your adjacent sectors and industries. But of course, if you define our sector as a built environment, which we are trying to push out now, right, then it does touch across a lot of different sectors. So I'll give you an example. We do a lot of research in green concrete, right, carbon negative concrete. But if you just think about it, to push something like that to the market, who are the players that need to get involved? We are just the users, right? We're the bricklayers. But you need to think about the supply chain, right? Because you talk about scope 2, scope 3. You got to think about where the materials come from. You think about manufacturers, the use of furnace. So it is quite lateral in that sense, just by design, because of the nature of the work that we do. So if you look at it, so the short answer is, if we look at construction tech, we actually don't really work with a lot of people within our ecosystem, and we do work with a lot of those adjacencies. But if we define it a bit broader as a built environment, then yes, of course, we will have to, by nature of the interface and what we're dealing with, just like physical structures and places.
Okay, that's interesting, looking at the adjacent spaces next to your industry and how we can build out a broader ecosystem. Maybe we'll come to Santosh for you to share a little bit more about.
Yeah, I think from the banking perspective, especially like if you look back 12 years, 15 years, when the technology started evolving, and then these technologies came together to provide financial solutions. That's when the fintechs came in, and then initially when they started off, everyone said, oh, you know what, fintechs are going to come take over, eat our lunch. There's no space for any other banks. Fintechs are going to rule the world. But as we evolved, what has happened is we see partnerships growing. If you look at collaboration that is happening, because every bank was looking at how we can solve the problem on the ground and how we can leverage emerging technologies, new business models. That's how we have evolved. And right now, I would say we are at a space where everyone is trying to collaborate and work together in terms of in a space where we are a regulated bank and we need these governance. We have seen lots of failures in last few years. where you just cannot depend on one particular service or a product. So that's where the banks come in. Like it gives you that safe space for your wealth and everything else that you need with financial technology. So that's how I would bring in as evolution of fintechs and solving the bank's real problems, and how we are now trying to collaborate and working with JVs. We work with other clients as well in terms of solving their problems. How can we come together and solve this big puzzle? And that leads to what we frame it as democratization of innovation. Like how do we bring in inside out and outside in?
Okay. So I mean, now that you raised the topic about regulation as well, right? I mean, financial institutions are heavily regulated. In some sense, aviation and even construction, there's quite a fair bit of regulations that you have to deal with, right? So when we come to industries that are dealing with regulation and you want to push innovation, particularly with partnerships, which then brings an added layer of complexity, right? What are some of the key challenges that you have come across in your work when dealing with some of these challenges when it comes to regulations, right? As well as trying to integrate that new element of innovation into your work itself, into the innovation that you deal with.
I think as Santosh, you were speaking about fintech, like the banking industry being heavily regulated. I was thinking about my own industry, Sidne's industry, super regulated actually, right? I didn't come from construction or real estate before. The last 4 or 5 years, exploring this space and started to realize that it was super regulated, right? We talk about like workplace safety, we talk about payment schemes, etc. It's very, very heavily regulated. What kind of technology you can and cannot use on site, right? Because there's again that physical interface that you can't run away from. So I understand why. So for us actually, and I think I'm very thankful for this, right? For us, our key stakeholder will be the BCA, right? Building Construction Authority of Singapore. They're very progressive, right? They're very progressive. The new leadership there that took over 3-4 years ago, their DY CEO, he's an ex-VC, so he understands about partnerships and engagement and adoption of technology. That's what they brought him in for, right? The CE, he's an EDB guy. So in terms of the way they think about pushing the industry forward and about productivity gains, and it's very aligned with the industry. And in this case, they are actually the ones pulling industry, right? I think in Singapore, there's a statistic that like thousands of contractors, like literally thousands for our small island, right? A small city state. Yeah, we build a lot, right? Like Penang, we build a lot, but so many builders that we have. And they are actually the ones pulling industry forward, which is quite funny, right? Because a lot of times it is the industry that's, regulations lagging behind industry. In our case, I think it's the other way around. It's flipped the card. So the position that I am in with the gear and the function that we serve, right, is actually benefiting from the regulator, right? And I don't know about other industries, but for us, we really do, right? And so how we do it, I would say the challenges are more internal. It's like a cultural piece, right? Not so much a regulation piece, because honestly speaking, touch my heart, and I say any BCA molds here, touch my heart, they really have done a really good job in promoting that. Not just not just BCA, there's also JTC, right? Singapore's largest landlord, right? That we work with very, very closely as well. And they have been super progressive, and I think we're very fortunate to have that in this sector.
So for us, I mean, when you think about the word innovation, it's very broad, right? It's quite hard to actually, there's a word I'm blanking on right now, but to determine the meaning of innovation. So we like to keep a mix of projects, some of which are very core business relevant to Lufthansa, and some of which are a bit more left field, like the NFT platform I told you about. So that's called Uptrip. It's a separate app altogether, and because it's a different interface and platform from Lufthansa's main product, we have free reign, right? And it's quite easy to actually just run a new product how we want to run it. Now, if we want to push an innovative project within the group, that's when regulations kick in. When you think about the aviation industry, there's a lot of systems we use on and off the planes that you'd be surprised at how dated they are. Because this is such a low risk industry, think about human lives on the plane, right? So anytime we want to adopt new technologies, you're actually taking on a lot of risk, and that's something that the group is sometimes unwilling to do. Now, the Innovation Hub has been around for 10 years. So clearly Lufthansa is investing a lot in the topic of innovation, however much they want to define it. But how we try to work with the regulatory restrictions is think about which markets do we have freer reign. As an example, in Europe, it's really hard to use customer data because of GDPR, right? And Singapore is the same thing with PDPA, but this does not restrict us from using customer data. It is people's perception, or rather the way that they interpret GDPR, that keeps us from using customer data in a certain way. So if we want to use customer data to, say, provide personalized services, right? We try to find a market in Asia where perhaps there's a little bit more leeway for us to be able to test this out, prove that it works, and prove that it's within legal boundaries, and then be able to then roll it out across the rest of the world. There are instances too where regulatory rollouts work in our favor. So sustainability, in aviation space, we're one of the biggest carbon emitters, right? So we're always working towards reducing that impact. Singapore just mandated the use of SAF on the planes, right? And so a regulation like that helps us think about, all right, what kinds of new sustainable aviation fuel technologies can we now incorporate as a result of the regulation? So it's good and bad, in my opinion.
Sorry, let me just add on to that. As you were talking about using markets as your test beds, essentially, right? So we do that, but on a much smaller scale. We have the gear now, right, as a building. Again, it's a very low risk industry. You just think about it. Sustainability, right? This is an example. I always give this example. If you want to be sustainable as a building owner, it's very easy. Just turn off all the air cons. You're done. But you can't. You have to balance the comfort of the occupants, etc. Right? That's one. Imagine now if you were you were CapitaLand and you owned Ion. Would you change your AC? The set point of the CapitaLand of Ion, if you can guess, is 21 degrees. It's really cold, right? Just a lot of people come in and out. 21 degrees. And it's not linear, right? The minute you go down 1 degree, 2 degrees, exponentially more energy is consumed, right? That's just the case. So if I were Ion and I'm saying, I want to be a bit more sustainable, right? Would you dare change it to 23? You won't. Because what you live and die by? You live and die by your cap rate. You live and die by how much footfall you have and what your tenants do. You will never then test it. So again, like aviation, again, maybe not life and death for aircon, right? But very low risk, very low risk. So what we have done in our small ways, that we built this gear building in Changi, right, far away from everybody, and we test, right? We try different things. We change the AC. There was once I changed one of the rooms, the co-working rooms, I changed it to 27 degrees, just to see how long it would take for people to complain and leave the room, right? So that's the nice thing that we have with the gear as a building, right? We don't play with markets, but we do play with this asset. So I think one way to work with regulators is also say, hey, we have this sandbox environment, come and work with us, right? So that's how we've tried to set it up. I think Fintech was the one that led the charge in that, right? Setting these up sandboxes. We sort of borrowed those ideas and did that for ourselves with the gear a couple of years ago. Yeah, sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, since we're on the topic of sandbox, I think that's appropriate now for me to kind of move to Santosh and share a little bit more about banking, right, as an industry. Because of the regulations, we spearheaded with sandboxes, right? So what are some of the maybe challenges or even best practice, right, that we've learned so far in terms of how we actually roll out new projects through sandboxes, right? And how can maybe more companies utilize some of these things, this kind of concepts within their company to experiment with innovation?
Yeah, in a way, experimentation is the key, and we continue to experiment, and you'll find something that comes out of it saying, yes, this is successful, let's take out to the real world. So just like maybe not as risky as the airline business or the construction business, where you can try it in the real world saying, hey, this building is made of bamboo sticks. or a plane with, 2 engines, or maybe make it single engine. But in banking, it's straightforward in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Again, it's a very heavily regulated industry, and the fintechs are here to push the boundaries. And we have seen new business models coming in, and then fairly successful as well. So for us, in terms of the experimentation itself, we have our own frameworks in terms of how much we can leverage the data. There is data sensitivity in terms of what data we can use, what data we cannot use. There's infrastructure. Right now you'll find so many scams happening, even really hard-hitting people, hard-earned money disappearing within a few seconds. So there are a lot of regulations, and those are there for a purpose. And what we're doing is, in terms of experimentation, we have our own frameworks in terms of how quickly we can use these separate infrastructure which is secure to experiment. And once we feel it is enough confidence that it is successful, we can deploy it in the real world. And it's all about pushing boundaries.
Yeah, very good. So on that, right, once we have experimented with sandboxes internally, right, and we've talked about how construction, aviation, banking are all industries with kind of low appetite for risk. I wouldn't really call it low risk, but it's really the appetite for risk that we have that's essentially fairly low, right? So experimenting within Singapore is all well, fine and good, right? But the kind of proof in the pudding in a way is kind of how do you actually commercialize that, right? So this is where I kind of want to move the conversation a little bit, and maybe Sidne, coming from Lufthansa, right? Could you share with us like what are some of the key learnings that you have in terms of how you can move a project from experimentation towards commercialization within the group, especially in an organization like Lufthansa, right? Which, like you said, right, has kind of low appetite for risk.
So we spend a lot of time, at least within my team, pitching projects internally, right? Because they hire us to be the creative ones. Now what we've learned is that gets us only so far, because it's very difficult to convince somebody that they need something unless they've realized it themselves. So say for example, we see a really cool startup at a conference and we're saying, oh, this would be great for our baggage handling team, right? We go in and we pitch it, and the team will say, yeah, that's cool, but I've got my day-to-day job. I mean, I don't know what you want me to do with this. So what we've now encouraged all the business units in Lufthansa to do is think about where technology can fill a gap in their day-to-day work, right? Everyone has frustrations in whatever they do on a daily basis, whether you're in the maintenance team or whether you're doing sales or whatever it is. Tell us about your problems. And so we started this this new cycle now of the business units coming to us saying, hey, I'm from X and X team. I actually face this problem in my daily work. What do you think you can do for us? And I found that helps us so much, because now we're actually plugging a gap and it's a lot easier to sell. And once you already make that sale, the business unit says, yeah, let's run a test. And when you run these tests, you got to make sure that the metrics of success are absolutely aligned with how Lufthansa board views the performance of the company. Because if we're just talking about, say, website engagement, right? Yeah, that could be cool to the team managing the website. But if you want to roll this out to Europe, there has to be a follow-on metric from that the board will say, okay, this is worthwhile testing here. Because if they just say, oh, engagement, it may not be a metric that they're particularly aligned with. So it's really about, first of all, aligning KPIs and also making sure that the people you're working with within the company already view the solution as helping them out, basically.
Look, maybe I want to move on to you, where you're also working on commercialization of IP for Kajima Group, right? Maybe this is a good segue in terms of commercialization. Can you maybe share a little bit more about kind of how you think about commercialization when it comes to such new innovation?
I think it's really hard. Like not just in my sector. I think bringing any research to market is super hard, right? I think a few years ago when Heng Swee Kiat was still overseeing NRF, he said, we spend billions of dollars on creating knowledge. Now, how do you turn that knowledge back to money, right? And that's the commercialization piece. If we just look at, all the universities, A-Star, whatever research institutes, you have thousands of researchers. So how many of these things actually go to market? I think the biggest one for Singapore in recent time was, I would say, Nanofilm. That was an NTU piece, right? It listed last big IPO for Singapore company last couple of years. So I think it's pretty difficult to bring that to market. For me now, my KPI is quite simple. I just need to prove where our supply intersects market demand. Because we've never actually done that study before, right? We have about 350 researchers across Japan and Singapore. So it's quite a large setup of those specifically looking at things as detailed as fire protection in buildings, right? And you have like 20 researchers just working on that. So we go very deep, right? So what we're trying to do right now is try to just uncover all this different supply that we have. And at the same time going to market and saying, hey, is there application in your business or in your sector, right? So we do research quite broad areas. We do things like, biodiversity in oceans, right? And then there may be some applications to different sectors like cattle farming. How does that link? So one example is red algae, right? It's supposed to be able to reduce cowbird and cow emissions and carbon emissions from cows. So we developed a way to basically grow more of that algae in a less space, right? How that came about was again in experimentation. What we're trying to figure out now is the use cases and application. Because previously, the application was very clear. The business units would be like, hey, I have a civil engineering problem, can you solve it? Now, the job of the gear and then my team is to figure out the use cases outside our businesses. I don't have the answer yet. I think it's quite difficult, and and again, I think the board does understand that, right? In Japan, they do understand that it's hard, right? They are also very cautious with certain things and what we bring to market, because again, we build for internal capability development. We spin it off, we lose competitive advantage, right? So there's also that like high level play which we need to bear in mind in Singapore here.
Maybe I could just add one thing as well. And while I talked about matching KPIs, there is also a precedence that we have set with our board at Lufthansa, that because we're running innovative projects, there has to be an understanding of how we view success metrics, right? That there is definitely a longer term goal of commercialization, because ultimately, any project that we run, the board would just say, how's this going to help us sell more tickets, right? Now, we've defined this into two different areas where the board works in exploitative and we work in explorative. And so because of that, the metrics are completely different. So the tests that we run, how we define success in the explorative nature of this project is such and such. And in a period of, I don't know, let's say 4 to 5 years, we're going to match this to how you see your exploitative KPIs. Because you cannot just always assume that you run this new innovative project and it's going to immediately give me ROI and revenue, right? That's not always the case. So there has to be that precedent set as well. And as long as there's that understanding, then we'll have a bit more freedom to innovate how we want to.
I think that brings me to Santosh, right? You work in fintech engagement, and part of it is to look at how we can use the capabilities of some of these fintechs to solve some of our business problems, which in a way it's something that Sidne touched on, right? Looking at the business challenges of the business units and trying to bring in new capabilities, right? Maybe from this perspective, then Santosh, could you just share with us how you have found, what are some of the most effective ways you have found to bridge the gap, right, between how startups who want to work with corporates, right, how can they really, when they get involved, how can they keep their eye on some of the matrices that large corporate have, right, which a lot of times could be quite divergent, right, with how a startup operates as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's not easy for fintechs to come in and work with bank, because essentially what happens is you have lots of policies and frameworks, regulations. It becomes like a giant hairball, right? How does one fintech come in and then try to solve that? It's like it seems like humongous problem. But then that's where we try to bring in, and then we are saying our mission is to rewire the DNA in banking, right? That's where we started around 6 years ago. And that's where we see it as opportunity. That's where we see it as new business models. And to me, whenever we engage a fintech, what's new that is coming into the bank? What are we trying to solve? And that transformation is the key in terms of, is it something that the bank will try to, again, it leads into a different conversation, buy versus build. But what is it that the fintech is trying to offer, and how we can best leverage that? Right? I mean, that's the key. And as soon as we figure out, okay, there is an opportunity here to work closely with the businesses and see how much we can leverage the technology and how much we can adapt it to our needs. So that's the key.
Okay. Sidne, do you have anything to add in terms of how you engage with startups and how you can tips that you have for these startups in terms of how they can be more successful in terms of working with corporates?
I always tell startups to be patient, mainly because when you think about Lufthansa, we're a 100,000 people organization. Things don't move at lightning speed, right? And so you're getting this contradiction of expectations between how the startup wants to move things forward versus how the reality of things that move in corporate, right? That does not mean that the corporation does not want these projects to move through, but just the expectation of timelines are a bit longer. And also to just ensure that, ensure that they're not overselling. I mean, we've always had startups coming in and overselling their product, and it confuses the hell out of the corporate, right? Because you're talking to people who are just in these large corporations focusing on the day-to-day job. It's already so difficult to sell a new concept internally, let alone get an overwhelming digestion of information about this new topic they've never really heard of before. So I'd say just patience and a bit more clarity.
So yeah, speed is relative. You can ask them to talk to me if they want to know what's. I guess for us, I won't talk about generic stuff. I think it's sector specific, right? So just to share, we have a huge network of different consultants, subcons, main cons. You have different stakeholders for every project. So what I always tell startups is this: who is you really need to build your war chart, right? Who's your influencer? Who's your decision maker? Who's actually paying for it? Who's actually using it? So I'll give you a simple example: wall painting robots, right? Who do you talk to? Who? You go to the project owner, which is the developer. You go to the contractor. You go to the painting robot guy. Like each project will have a different dynamic. So you really need to figure out who's the one with that agenda, who's the one that's pushing it. I think that's very specific. So unfortunately, it doesn't become very scalable, to be honest, for the sector. I think that's why I don't see that many construction technology companies flourishing, to be very honest. But yes, you do need to be patient. You do need to understand like who's the different stakeholder. I think it changes in the markets, it changes in the projects, right? So I always say that Singapore and most developed markets actually are very developer driven. They're the ones which are pushing the needle. They're Capless, Maple. They're the ones pushing all this different agenda. In Japan, it's very different. In Japan, the general contractor is king, right? And that's why you have Kajima, Yoshimizu, Takenaka, Obayashi, etc. Right? Because they are the ones, right? And the buck stops with them. If the developer says, no, I want to build this beam in this way, the general contractor will say no. And why? Safety. They'll say, oh, safety. Because I run on earthquakes and floods and everything. So the general contractor is the one that's king, and they're the ones that's pushing it. So depending on the markets, right, that does change. Right? In Singapore, I think it's quite clear it's the developer that's the one pushing it. Yeah. So I think understanding that that relationship and that power dynamic is very important if you wanted to sell into this industry.
One more point I wanted to make is that if there's startups in this room and you're trying to work with a corporate, make sure that the person you're speaking with on the other side can be your spokesperson, right? And I say this, and that person must be able to really help you navigate the organization. What I've learned, at least, it's not exactly about always talking to the highest ranking person in the organization, right? It's not just that everything goes up to the CEO. Sometimes you might find yourself lucky contacting a person within the organization that has enough, I don't know, initiative to want to push out this experiment on his own, and he's able to make he or she is able to make all the autonomous decisions within his own capacity. So yeah, I would say don't always just go for the highest ranking person, because that sometimes will just lead you nowhere.
Good. Thanks very much for those tips. I just want to kind of ask one final question before we move on to Q&As, right? My question is basically looking forward, right? What do you think are some of the emerging technology or trends, right, you think will reshape how partnerships will drive innovation in your respective industries, right? And if you can, because it's Singapore Fintech Festival, if you could touch a little bit on where you think is the relevance for maybe fintech in your industry as well, that could be helpful. Right?
Sure, I can start. Well, on the main industry itself, what I'm particularly excited about is electrification of mobility. Right? I mean, all of us see the air taxis and electric cars and everything like that. I think I'm really looking forward to seeing a world where we have complete full electric mobility. And I've seen electric yachts, for example, coming into play as well. So we talk about ships, the maritime industry, huge carbon emitter as well. So I think that's why I'm interested in that. Now in the fintech space, we have two main offices of the Innovation Hub, one in Asia and one in Berlin. We cover the APAC region mainly because we believe that Asia is completely fragmented, right? We work with a lot of Europeans, unfortunately, that believe that Asia is China, right? So we always have to kind of showcase how different Asia is from China to India to Korea to Indonesia. These are all extremely different markets with different behaviors. So case in point on the payments front, if you go on the Lufthansa website in Europe and you buy a product and you check out, there's basically Amex, MasterCard, PayPal, and I think those are the few, right? Now when you come to Asia, there's so many different digital payment providers that if we don't work with them, you're basically you're going to places like China and offering MasterCard and Visa as a checkout option, right? And these customers are going to go on there and say, well, if there's no WeChat or Alipay, I'm just going to buy a product that will allow me to use these features. And so it's not only about understanding what the customer's preferences are for payment methods in the different markets in Asia, but also the behaviors, right? Split payments. We've attempted to work with SC Ventures on a topic of group travel management, because we realized that customers in Asia actually like to travel in groups versus more so than customers in the West, right? So that's a product and a payment journey that we thought we wanted to test out here in Asia, and that only came because we're based here and trying to understand what customers here wanted to do. So I'm excited for seeing more of that within Lufthansa.
So for me, two parts, right? So the first, in terms of trends, I think we'll see a lot more collaboration with those in the wellness space, so like healthcare across the spectrum, right? Because I think, post-COVID, everyone's thinking about occupant well-being. Is it safe? Is it good for me to come back? People are not going back to offices. So I think you really need to create a very nice environment and a space for people to want to go. There's a purpose. As I always say, if you put a restaurant, not a famous restaurant on level 5, no one's ever going to go. Right? Put a tuition center, doesn't matter where it is. Right? right? Parents will send their kids anyway. It's the same thing, right? I think people are starting to get more aware of these things. So I think you see a lot more intersection with well-being type providers and also asset owners. I think that's going to be a huge push. So not just sustainability anymore, right? Balancing that with the experience. So I think that's something that you see. In terms of fintech space, can't say too much at the moment, but we are looking at some things where can you balance, site risk and insurance? Can you balance that with getting paid on time? Because the thing about contractors and subcons, why everyone goes bust is that subcons don't get paid, right? And then they'll say, oh, because my contractor didn't get paid, and it's a cascading waterfall of, crap. So that does happen a lot, and that's something which we are looking at, right? Can you find out new ways to say just trade financing or factoring, right? I think those are things using basic technologies like AI, machine learning, and then predicting whether or not this subcon is going to flip, whether it's going to run away, etc. So in the fintech space, that's what we're looking at. But yeah, still very, very early days for us, to be honest.
No one's paying for buildings with credit cards yet?
No, not yet, unfortunately. It'd be great though with points.
Yeah, I think in banking, as everyone knows, it's evolving, and it's like, we have been through a few hype cycles, but I think we know digital assets are here to stay. There's a lot of work happening in AI space as well, so there's not much to talk about, but then there's evolving space as well. So we see a trend which is more on data, AI. That's the key these days, and then in terms of how we are going to enable that through our ventures. So that's going to be the key for the going forward.
Right. Thanks, Santosh. And thanks, panelists. I think we've had a pretty wide-ranging discussion so far, right? I think with that, I want to kind of open it up to the floor, to the audience. If anyone has any questions that you would kind of like to ask our panelists. Particularly, I think when it's an opportunity to ask questions that are really not entirely finance, fintech related, where we can cross industries and explore how opportunities might persist between industries, right, where we can actually share best practices. Anyone has any questions?
What are some failures of innovation that you had, or some projects that failed, and what are the learning lessons you had from these projects?
That's something nobody wants to talk about. But again, it all depends on the business model and what are you trying to solve for. So it's not about failing and stopping there, it's about being relentless. Actually, that reminds me, has anyone tried to go to relentless.com?
Amazon, it's Amazon, yeah.
It is, yeah. So if you, remember, 20, I don't know, whenever, Bezos decided to create this company, he registered this URL called relentless.com. It's a redirection to amazon.com. That's the biggest learning in terms of how do you learn from your failures and how do you get on with what you're trying to solve for.
I can talk about one. I would say it's a mix of a success and a failure. So we realized that customer behaviors here versus the West were slightly different on our website, in that in Asia, customers like to go on our website and browse, or go on a airline website and browse travel content before buying a ticket. Whereas our colleagues in Germany were saying that customers go on a website with the intention to already buy a ticket, and they just buy a ticket and leave, right? So we wanted to test out this behavior. We found a startup in Korea that could essentially plug in existing content into our main website just to see, not only does this affect the engagement on our website, but how does it affect conversion? So I say it's a success because the moment the content went up, engagement spiked, right? Customers in the region were definitely browsing the top 10 destinations traveled by Lufthansa passengers in the region. Now what we didn't realize is that just the way that the website was managed, there was no way to track conversion, right? And so again, I talked about those KPIs with the board, right? It's one thing to present high engagement on the website, but it's one thing to not be able to track how that affect conversion, because then that's an absolute field test, right? You can have 1 million people browsing your website every day and not buying a single thing, and there's no way to track that. So I think that was kind of a learning for us to make sure that we're looking at the right success metrics and to be able to actually access that data.
Very deep in thought.
It's like, well, don't really have a specific example, but it's just I think it's the way I think about it, right? It's a framing of the question, like for a Japanese company and corporate culture where everything goes back to headquarters and everything. I think there's also playing the game a little bit where if you couch it as a failure, it will be seen as a failure. If you couch it as a learning, or that it was successful, but like it's a lot of perspective and framing, right? Especially like I'm here, small fish, and then my big boss is this 70-year-old man sitting in Japan who I've met one time. How's he gonna receive it? So how I look at it, especially when it comes to innovation, something new. Okay, if it's a commercial project, it's very simple. Lost money, make money. That's it. How much did I spend, right? Kajima got destroyed 15 years ago. We did civil engineering overseas, lost about 15B in 1 year. Fire sale of assets, right? Recovered from it, fine. Clear failure, right? But when it comes to innovation specifically, setting the KPIs is important, couching in a certain way. I think that's something which, for myself, I do try to like play around with a little bit, and then make sure that, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Even if this startup doesn't actually take, or the project doesn't spin off and things like that, what do we gain from it, right? So I always put what's the worst case scenario, and then after that I try and play it out. Again, I haven't had too many projects, very new companies, very new setup, right? But that's generally how I think about it. And I will never go in the room saying that, okay, it failed. Because then they'll be like, okay, that's it, there's no second chances in that sense. Yeah. It's not like embrace failure, well, still culture, no, it's not like that. Not at all.
I think that's an interesting perspective, right? Because innovation within a corporate is somewhat different from innovation within the startup ecosystem, but yet you need to kind of blend the two as well, right? Santosh brought up a very good point, right? You want to be relentless, right? But in being relentless, it's not about just accepting failure after failure after failure, but in terms of how you can really position the story that you tell yourself, not just your stakeholders actually, because you need to really be able to manage yourself and pick yourself up after a failure and tell yourself that this is fine. What have I really learned and how can I go on? And it really is not that big in the overall scheme of things. You have a chance to kind of recover from it as well, right? Yeah. Next question, anyone?
When you are looking for a startup to collaborate with, what are kind of the key elements that you evaluate aside from, I guess, the product that they offer? What makes you choose to actually collaborate?
Well, at least for me, I already, at least now, have an idea of the problem statements that have been submitted to me from the different business units. So if I attend, say, a conference, I'll typically have an intention of looking out for certain startups that can somewhat plug that problem statement that's been given to me. But aside from that, we're actually extremely open. We don't just look for late stage startups. We try with early stage startups as long as they have a ready product. In fact, sometimes we run some pretty interesting tests with startups in the early stages with an existing product because they're so keen to work with a company like Lufthansa and they move really quickly, right? Again, with knowing the patience of needing to work within our organization. But I think that's essentially how I do it. I now go with an intention in mind already, so it's not really needing to analyze as much, really.
If it's beyond product, I actually look a lot at the operators. I'll see whether I want to spend time with the guy. So spending hours, right, working on solving a problem, and I'll be very frank, right, small room here. I'll see if I like working with the person. Have they done that research? Is it someone that you gel with, right? Do they understand your corporate culture? Are you like I think that's a huge part of it, to be honest. It's like your early stage VCs when they invest, they see market, they see product, they see the founder, whether they like the guy, right? So that's what I really think about. Like those which I realize that I really push forward, I have an actual like relationship with them where I understand what they're doing, they understand what I'm doing, right? And then they can sort of bridge that.
Yeah, one more point, that brought up a point in my head as well, and that to me communication is so important. If I meet a startup that cannot tell me what their company does in less than 10 minutes, right? That's usually an issue because again, these startups are going to be talking to our colleagues in Europe who not only don't have any context in Asia, but they're not really exposed to the tech industry. And if you talk at someone with your pitch deck for 45 minutes, good luck trying to drive an experiment. So I think clear communication is something that's super important for me.
I put the same in terms of the first key is of course the product fit. Like what is the product that you're going to offer and how do we benefit from that? And I think the second key is of course the communication. What are you trying to solve for? Because we have seen, like I have myself seen startups where they come and pitch, but then when you go for a demo, it turns out to be slightly different than what they pitched for. So that's the key. If you're unable to communicate, then it's a different ballgame.
Yeah, I've been booked like hour-long, meetings by startups, and they spent 55 of those minutes talking at me, and I've not said a single word. And then in the last 5 minutes, any questions? And I'm thinking I've lost you in the first 10, right? I've not been listening to you for the last half an hour. So I think if startups don't have that in mind, that wow, this guy's not said a single word, like need to at least be aware of how to run a pitch.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So communication indeed important to be listening. So opportunity for one final question if anyone wants to kind of raise a burning question.
Just a quick one for Sidne. So you said 100,000 people in Lufthansa, big organization. So how do you kind of sell this opportunity of innovating on, because there's resistance to change, it's a large organization. How do you manage around that?
We do a lot of pitches. Yeah, like constantly. So a lot of my mandate is to go to different markets and pitch different ideas. Not only encouraging the business units to think about what problems they might face, because each market's different. So in Korea, as an example, we realized that the local customer doesn't resonate much with the Lufthansa brand. We wanted to offer products that could resonate more with the local customers. So we're looking to sell golf as an ancillary, and because golf is such a big product in Korea, right? So that's an example of something we might try in Korea and not over in I would say Japan, but let's say Indonesia or something like that, right? So I spend a lot of my time with my team going to the different markets and just trying to encourage people to submit ideas, really.
And how's the uptake been?
For
what-
ideas?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, tremendous now. I mean, I think you may have come in after I shared with the room that initially was trying to convince the business units of new creative ideas. But it's very hard to convince people of something they don't know they need, right? So now what I try to do is to get them to actually tell us what their issues are, so then it's a lot easier to solve for.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think with that, we've kind of come to the end of the panel. I want to ask the audience to join me in a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I think we learned quite a bit about innovation partnership today in terms of how we need to manage, I think, what was not really said explicitly about managing culture, right? Managing different stakeholders across global organizations as well is very important, and how we need to really embrace failure in a positive way, right? Not call it failure, but kind of move forward and couch the message properly. But with that, thank you very much for your attention today as well, audience.
Thank you.